seen this, but there has been a lot of comment going after Michael Jones coming out on YouTube in the last week. I said I wasn't going to do this anymore, but after watching this, holy crap. This is some of the most broken and backwards and despicable apologetics I've ever seen. I'm not really going to make this video about Michael because he's doing an impossible task, apologetics. It is not my opinion that Jones is a bad person, but apologetics, you start with the conclusion and then you work backwards with the data and the facts and interpret them in light of your conclusion. And because of that, you have to say things that are either stupid or horrible. And this is some of the most stupid, horrible stuff I've ever heard. So let's talk about consent.
Yes.
Well, maybe God would learn a lesson about consent and asking for it before he knocks up a teenager.
What are you talking about? The Bible tells us Mary was a virgin. There was no intercourse involved. It also doesn't tell us Mary's age when Jesus was conceived. Scholarly estimates indicate that Jewish girls in Palestine at this time would marry between their late teens to early 20s. So Mary was probably around the age of 18.
Okay, so we'll start here. I looked up these papers. That first paper, I cannot find it anywhere online for free, but the title of the paper is Brother-Sister Marriages in Rome and Egypt. I can find the abstract for it, and it doesn't talk anywhere in there about like how old people were when they got married. It was just about the rate of brother-sister marriages. I did find a bunch of open source papers that cite that paper, and I combed through every time that this paper was referenced in those open source papers, and there's no reference to an age of marriage. Now, I have seen him historically throw up papers that have nothing to do with his argument before, but I haven't been able to access the full document. That one in the middle, I did find that, and it does explicitly say that Palestinian Jews would marry in their late teens to early 20s. But now let's go back to the beginning of what he said. So he was intentionally strawmanning his opponent. She didn't say that God put the P in the V. She said knocked up, which means to make somebody pregnant. That is what that means. If you artificially inseminate somebody, you knocked them up. And no, there was no consent. We're getting to that pretty soon. It's also hilarious how he said, "What are you talking about?" And then he presented data that agrees with what they said.
Knocks up a teenager.
So Mary was probably around the age of 18.
Knocks up a teenager.
So Mary was probably around the age of 18. And most importantly, Luke tells us that Mary consented to God's plan. She wasn't forced to go along with this against her will.
This is all I can fit on the screen. I'm not going to read this. You can read it if you want. But the idea that this is consent is just absolutely indefensible. The story does not go, "Mary, the Lord God requests a favor from you. Mary, would you be willing to do something?" The story goes, "Hey, this is going to happen to you." And Mary says, "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled." This is a slightly different translation than the one he put up there. He has the ESV, I believe. In any case, this is not an agreement. This is not a response to a request. This is not servitude. This is acknowledging that somebody else is telling me what is going to happen to me. It does not say, "Will you?" It says, "You will." Now, instead of bickering over what's plainly obvious, just address this question. What would have happened if Mary had said no? Wasn't this all part of God's plan? Wasn't this foretold? Wasn't Mary the only person who could have done this? That's maybe a little bit more of a Catholic perspective, which I think Jones is. But in any case, wasn't all of this required to save mankind? So no was not an option.
Now, some argue that Mary really didn't have a choice in the matter regarding Jesus' conception. She didn't have the power to negotiate, nor was she explicitly offered a choice in the matter. So she really wasn't free to say yes because there was no alternative possibility. Therefore, it was impossible for her to freely consent.
Okay, never mind. He does get it.
But this is based on an outdated understanding of free will.
Oh, never mind. He doesn't get it.
Which assumes that free will requires the ability to do otherwise. But Frankfurt cases named after the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, show that this is not the case. A typical Frankfurt case can run like this. Mr. Black wants to unalive Mr. Smith, but he's not going to do it himself. Instead, he puts a mind control device in someone we will call Mr. Jones. Now, if Mr. Jones decides not to unalive Mr. Smith, the device will switch on and force him to do it. However, Mr. Black observes that Mr. Jones goes in and unalives Mr. Smith of his own free will, and the device never switches on and forces him to do it. In this hypothetical case, Mr. Jones lacks the ability to do otherwise, but he is still morally responsible for unaliving Mr. Smith. Therefore, moral responsibility, or consenting to something, does not require the ability to do otherwise.
What is it doing? Michael, is Mary Mr. Jones or Mr. Black? Is God Mr. Jones or Mr. Black? Frankfurt's point in that hypothetical you gave is that Mr. Jones is still morally responsible, even though Mr. Jones could not have done otherwise. If Mr. Jones had the switch triggered by Mr. Black, then Mr. Jones would not be morally responsible. In no way does this answer as to whether or not Mary consented. Mary was going to become pregnant regardless of whether or not she said yes, but that does not remove the possibility of consent. Mary's not the one doing the impregnating. Mary is Mr. Jones from your hypothetical. God is Mr. Black. Mr. Black's the bad guy in your story. This is why I say he gets away with being dishonest and lazy, because his audience will never think about anything that he says. They're expecting him to do PR for their beliefs, and they just accept it. You can't even be charitable with this. If Jones I don't know what Jones's position on free will is. Let's say he's a compatibilist. I feel like that's the only reasonable position a Christian can take, because if God knows everything that will happen in the future, then that makes the future predetermined. But compatibilism is sort of it's how you can decide to believe in free will, even though the future is predetermined in a sense, because compatibilism says that you engage in free will when we engage in our own desires. Now, whose desire was Mary acting in accordance with?
And there are much better ways to define free will, like the one proposed by Robert Kane, which is that free will is the power to be the ultimate creator and sustainer of one's own ends and purposes.
So that, to me, is libertarian free will. In no sense whatsoever was Mary expressing libertarian free will. I don't see how libertarian free will exists in the Christian worldview, but I don't, that's not the purpose of this video. Mary was acknowledging what God, who appears to be the only one with true libertarian free will in the Christian worldview, what God said is going to happen, according to his will. Kind of like what Jesus said when he acknowledged he would be tortured and killed. If it is your will that this thing be done.
Or the one proposed by Michael McKenna and Dirk Perboom. Free will is the unique ability of persons to exercise the strongest sense of control over their actions necessary for moral responsibility.
Okay, well that's a compatibilist view. Like he got up there and seriously said, oh, there are much better versions of free will. Here are two irreconcilable versions of it. This is libertarian free will. The individual is the ultimate creator and sustainer of one's own ends and purposes. This is compatibilism, the strongest sense of control over their actions.
So because free will does not require the ability to do otherwise, Mary could consent to God's plan, regardless if she was offered an alternative possibility or not.
Yeah, hypothetically, she could have consented, like the Mr. Jones example. Everything we've been over so far has distanced us greatly from those verses in Luke. Maybe that's intentional. Either way, here are those words again. This is not consent.
We also must remember that since God is omniscient, he would know the right woman to pick for this important task, who would be fully on board and not feel coerced at all.
The presuppositional baggage that goes along with this whole, if we affirm that God is omniscient, if we just assume that in the first place, that baggage weighs more than Santa's bag of toys. See, this is the honesty sneaking in, which is nice to see. Yes, it would be terrible if she had no control in the matter, which would mean that if she didn't consent, it would be forced upon her anyways, which is what happened. But if we assume that God could not have been capable of making a mistake here, hide your kids, hide your wife. See you tomorrow.